بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فلولا نفر من كل فرقة منهم طائفة ليتفقهوا في الدين ولينذروا قومهم إذا رجعوا إليهم لعلهم يحذرون.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة لأهل التقوى واليقين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين العبد المؤيد الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. أما بعد، فقد قال الحكيم في كتابه الكريم: فاسألوا أهل الذكر إن كنتم لا تعلمون. The concept of taqlid is one of the controversial concepts that have been discussed over history and debated by scholars, jurisprudents, and theologians. Taqlid is a subject which is discussed both in jurisprudence as well as theology. And of course, there are some people who are raising questions and creating doubt, casting doubt in the minds of the people. Obviously, they have not understood the concept of taqlid properly and clearly. Otherwise, taqlid is very reasonable, very understandable. There is no doubt as to the fact that everybody, every individual in his life is following someone else in one way or the other. Because no one is experienced, no one is an expert in all fields, in all subjects, and in all disciplines. There are experts for different fields. There are scientists in different fields of science. There are scholars who specialize in different fields of education. And the same way that we see in our daily life, there are people whom we turn to, whom we refer to in order to seek their advice. We should also refer to a scholar, a jurisprudent, to follow his advice in religious matters and in the area of practical laws. Of course, it has to be clarified that taqlid and the fundamentals of Islamic law is not permissible. It is not allowed to follow someone in the tenets of the religion and the roots of the religion and in those important pillars of the religion. We have to understand them with our own insight and with our own knowledge and with our own effort. We should not, for example, follow our parents when they tell us that God is one, or when they tell us that there is resurrection, or that God is just. We can never follow our parents or anyone else in the fundamentals of the religion, i.e. monotheism, justice, leadership, imamat as it's termed in jurisprudence, and also prophethood. These are something that we have to understand, we have to perceive, and we have to imbibe understand with our own insight and our own knowledge. Taqlid in the essentials of the religion is also not permissible. There are some issues which are very conspicuous, very clear, such as, for example, the necessity of prayers, the necessity of paying khums, and the necessity of paying zakat, and also the necessity of observing fast. These are very conspicuous, these are very essential, and these are known to everyone, and one cannot follow a jurisprudent because he is telling us that fasting is obligatory. Fasting is obligatory, of course. It is mentioned in the Holy Quran, it is mentioned in the traditions, and of course we do not need to follow the scholars, the jurisprudence in such matters. Of course we have to study the Holy Quran, we have to get acquainted with the tradition, and also we have to be acquainted with the Islamic teachings, Islamic doctrines, so that we can understand what is obligatory and what is not obligatory, what is essential and what is not essential. Taqlid is something that has to be practiced only in those matters which are unconspicuous, or which is ambiguous, because we might fall into error, we might fall into mistake, we might commit error as a result of not understanding the issues properly. We have to follow a jurisprudent. A jurisprudent or a mujtahid is one who is capable of understanding and inferring the Islamic laws. A jurisprudent or a mujtahid is one who uses all his faculty, all his capacity to derive Islamic laws from their sources. He is one who endeavors to extract and to deduce the Sharia law from the authoritative sources. Of course, there are certain authoritative sources according to Shia jurisprudence. The most important of them is the Holy Quran. The next is the Sunnah or the tradition, and the third one is the reason, aql, or the intellect, and the fourth one is the consensus. These are the four important sources for derivation of Islamic laws. There is no fifth source, of course. A jurisprudent makes his best effort to drive the Islamic laws from these sources. He refers to the Holy Quran to see if there is an Islamic law, and he makes his best effort to understand them properly. And of course, he also refers to the tradition, because the tradition somehow provides explanation for those verses, for the verses regarding jurisprudence or regarding practical laws and the Holy Quran. The tradition provides exposition, clarification on those verses. If there is no such indication, if there is no clarity, or if there is no law or rule in the Quran nor in the tradition, then he uses the reason, the intellect, the internal profit, the internal faculty, which helps men deduce and drive Islamic laws from their sources. And of course, the last one is the consensus. Consensus is what the scholars say ijma. Ijma is also an authority. If all the scholars agree on a certain matter, of course they do not agree without a reason, without any proof. There must be a reason behind it that supports that consensus. If all the scholars, if all the jurisprudents agree on some matters, then of course that is also authoritative. Whatever they decide, their decision is authoritative for us. Their decision must be followed and must be abided by us as laymen, as people, as ordinary people. Because laymen cannot act on precaution. You might know that there are three options. One is to follow a mujtahid. That is what we call taqlid. And the second one is to act on precaution. Precaution is very difficult. You cannot understand and you cannot cover all the areas of fiqh or jurisprudence to understand what is precautionary and what is not precautionary, what is close to precaution and what is remote, far from precaution. And the third option is to be a mujtahid. Of course, all people cannot become mujtahid. Only few people can become mujtahid. And it's not obligatory, of course, for all people to become mujtahid, because they have to engage in other activities. The Muslim society needs experts, technicians, pilots, drivers, farmers, engineers. All these experts are needed. And if everyone goes to fiqh, to understand fiqh, to acquire fiqh, the knowledge of jurisprudence, then of course the society will not be built up. There will be no prosperity, there will be no advancement in the Islamic society. Therefore, if a few people engage in acquiring jurisprudence and acquiring fiqh, then others are relieved of the obligation. This is very important to note. And when there are, of course, a few scholars, a few jurisprudence, we have to try to find the most learned of them. And then once we have identified the most learned of the mujtahids, then we must follow him. It's very much important. And it's very wise to follow the most learned of the mujtahids. The more learned a mujtahid, the less mistakes he commits. The less learned a mujtahid, the more mistakes he commits. That's why it's essential, it's important, it's obligatory to follow the most learned, the most knowledgeable, the most qualified, and the most eligible mujtahid. Now the question arises as to how we can identify the most learned mujtahid. How can we identify, how can we know that a certain mujtahid is the most learned of all mujtahids in the Shia world? Of course, again there are three ways for identifying the most learned of the mujtahids. The first way is that you yourself is a faqih, a jurist who has been acquainted with the mujtahid, with the jurisprudent, and you know very well, since you have also been with him, and you know that he is qualified for taqlid. So you can act according to your knowledge, because you are not a layman, you are a jurisprudent yourself, but you are not someone who can deduce Islamic law. You are not someone who has enough competence to drive Islamic laws from their sources. But you have indeed the power to identify the most learned of the scholars. So you can act according to your own knowledge and according to your own understanding.
ناجيتك يا رحمن ودعوتك يا ديان يا خالق الإنسان الله 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 يا خالق الإنسان الله الله الله.
The second way is when there are two people, two just people. Just means a person who does not commit haram and a person who stays away from haram and performs the obligatory acts. If two just people from the jurisprudence, from the scholars, from the religious scholars, from those people who have studied jurisprudence, testify or bear witness that a certain mujtahid is the most learned of the mujtahids, then you can follow them, you can act according to their testimony, you can follow the person about whom those two just people testified or bore witness. The third criteria for identifying the most learned of the scholars is when a certain mujtahid has become so popular, so well known in the Islamic world and the Shia world, that it leaves no doubt in the mind of the follower. He is assured, or he becomes sure, that a certain mujtahid who has become very much popular and very well known in the Islamic world is actually the most learned of the mujtahids. Now, as I understand, there are people who make telephone calls to the offices of the religious authorities to ask whether a certain mujtahid is the most learned mujtahid or not. Of course, a mujtahid himself never says that he is the most learned of all, or he is qualified or not, or whether he is eligible or not. He never tells that. He has issued a risala, he has written a risala and has said it on the first page or on the first page of the risala that acting upon the risala is valid, and that whoever acts according to the risala will be relieved of the obligation, God willing. And also the same is true with those people who work in the offices of the religious authorities. It's never rational, it's never correct to make a phone call to the offices of the religious authorities to ask them whether a certain mujtahid, or whether the mujtahid who represents that office is the most qualified or not. You have to ask jurisprudence who have associated with him, who have studied with him, who have lived with him, and who have maybe been with him for many years. Therefore, it's very important to note that the testimony of a layman, a lay individual, an ordinary person, a person out in the streets, is not acceptable. There are people who engage in bitter discussion. There are people, of course, I have seen, who engage in discussions and debate regarding a certain, for example, jurisprudence, trying to prove or to argue that a certain mujtahid is more learned or more knowledgeable. Such discussions carry no value, because the ordinary people, whatever they say, whatever they talk about a certain mujtahid, will not have any value for a person who is looking for the most learned mujtahid, or a person who tries to identify the most learned of the mujtahids. And of course, as I mentioned, identifying the most learned mujtahid should be in accordance with the criteria which I mentioned. And as I mentioned, acting according to precaution is very difficult. It is impossible for ordinary people, for lay people to act according to precaution. Because one who acts according to precaution, he must understand, he must know what is precautionary and what is not precautionary. He must be acquainted with fiqh. How can one act on precaution when he has no knowledge of jurisprudence, when he has no understanding of fiqh? On the other hand, I give you an example and you will understand that acting on precaution is very difficult. Now this example should be the concluding example also. If you leave your hometown after midday without offering your prayer, for example, when the midday prayer, the Dhuhr prayer has become obligatory and you leave your hometown intending to offer your midday prayer when you are away from the city, as short of course, but then on the journey also, during the journey when you are away from your hometown, you have covered a distance of 44 or 45 kilometers where you have to shorten your prayers. You miss your prayers. You cannot, or you forgot to offer your prayers. Now again you have gone back to your hometown and there you want to offer your prayers. Which form of the prayer you should offer? Should you offer complete prayer, or should you offer the qasr prayer, the shortened prayer? If you want to act on precaution, you have to offer both full and short prayers. You have to act first the full prayers and then the shortened form of the prayers, or the qasr prayer. But if you are not acting on precaution, you will have to offer either qasr prayer or full prayer, depending on the fatwa of your mujtahid. If your mujtahid says that, okay, if you offer the full prayer it will be sufficient, you have to act according to his fatwa. Or if he says that you have to offer the short form of the prayer, the shortened prayer, then you have to act according to his advice and according to his fatwa. Fatwa is actually a clear saying of the mujtahid when there is no precaution. Wherever there is precaution, the mujtahid has not reached a conclusion, has not reached a clear-cut decision. He exercises precaution, and precaution is, of course, necessary when a mujtahid does not arrive at a conclusion. In matters of precaution, a person is free to either act according to the fatwa, to the precaution which has been exercised by his mujtahid, or he has to follow the next most learned mujtahid. Al-a'lam fal-a'lam. He has to follow the next most learned mujtahid in matters of precaution if he does not want to act according to precaution. If he acts according to precaution, of course he can act according to precaution. And if he does not want to act according to precaution, then he must refer to the next most learned mujtahid who does not exercise precaution and who has a clear-cut fatwa, a clear-cut verdict. And of course, one has to make sure that the person to whom he refers has a fatwa. If he is also exercising precaution, then he cannot refer to him. But if he has a fatwa, a verdict, then he is allowed to follow him, and he must make sure that the next mujtahid is also the most, and of course the next most learned mujtahid. And as I mentioned, if you want to identify the next most learned mujtahid, also you have to follow the same criteria, the same standards, and the same principles which I mentioned in the beginning of this session. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
اللهم اختم بعفوك أجلي وحقق في رجاء رحمتك أملي وسهل إلى بلوغ رضاك سبلي وحسن في جميع أحوالي عملي.